Hi, my name is KJ Phillips. I'm an ATP SMS for over 10 years, and welcome back to Adaptive Solutions. We're on session 8 of our ATP exam prep, and you'll notice the last couple lessons have a lot more to do with real life as an ATP, and that information applies to the ATP exam. So we're kind of balancing that between giving good test prep suggestions, but also the way you're going to pass the test is by being a great ATP in real life. All right, let's get started. Today we're covering our second section of implementation of intervention. That means delivery, more or less, but not limited to just delivery. The important thing is that our implementation of that strategy isn't done just after delivery in a controlled context. Really, we stay in that phase until the device has been integrated into their life the way that they need to. You've probably seen this happen in real life. You spend time with a client, maybe hours, fit it very well, make sure they can use it, teach them how to use it. A week later, they send you a message and say, "Hey, KJ, I haven't really used the device since." Why? Probably because they were having trouble using it in the context where they really needed to in real life. Therapy or at their home during delivery is a very controlled circumstance. And so today we're talking about troubleshooting outside those circumstances. All right, when you hear the client had an issue with using the device, your first instinct may be to go like, what went wrong? Let's start all over. I picked the wrong device. No. At this point, you should have built on very solid foundation from your assessment to your equipment trials to documenting the need for that equipment to then trying to look ahead to problem solve with what the issues could be. And so don't second guess yourself thinking the whole device was wrong. Today, we're going to learn that in different contexts, there are very different demands in using the same equipment. The question is, which part of the plan that we made didn't really carry over into their real life? That's what this phase is about. In session 7, at initial delivery, we focused on getting the device delivered, configured, and fit correctly, and then train the patient and their support system on how to use it, and practice doing some basics tasks. It's all controlled, it's all structured. Now we move into something much less structured. From AT Principles and Practice textbook, the AT only becomes effective when it's properly integrated into the user's daily routines and environments. So the section is not about can they use it in the right circumstances. It's about do they actually use it in their everyday tasks. All right, so how this shows up on the AT exam. Honestly, you're just not going to get a question that says, what is environmental integration in the implementation of strategies phase? Just not going to happen. The test will describe a scenario that sounds like the patient was delivered a device, fit, and we practiced, and the patient used it well. Everything looked correct. They demonstrated success. And a week later, it's not working. Or a month later, you find out the patient never really used it. Your job is to recognize and take a little step by step before thinking the whole device was a problem. See that the integration of the device in their everyday life was really the issue. Okay, for example, a student is provided with an AAC device and demonstrates effective communication during delivery at therapy. However, the teacher reports that the student is not using the device in the classroom and instead relies on gestures. Now pause. The device works. The student can use it. What's the problem? RESNA wants you to recognize that function is not determined in a structured, controlled place. The function of the device is determined by the person, in the activity they're doing, in the environment they're doing it in. And what changed there was the environment. The classroom introduces lots of noise, which is distracting, different expectations, different communication partners, meaning they're not talking just to therapists, they're talking to teachers and other kids, their aide. Different timing demands, which is huge with AAC devices. Answers that you'll see as a general pattern are often on the test. You'll see one or two answers that are just obviously wrong. They have nothing to do with the question, nothing to do with the context. Like, replace the AAC device. No. Conduct a whole new assessment. I mean, there's more troubleshooting to do before you do that. Reduce the device complexity. Well, maybe they'll need to reduce the device complexity if the child shows that they continually cannot perform. But first, before any of that, you should train the classroom staff and adapt use in that setting. So you want to make sure you're taking the next step. For example, replacing the device, no, you're skipping a lot of steps. You haven't troubleshot at all in that environment. Conduct a new assessment. I mean, it's not 100% wrong, but you are skipping steps again. Before that, you need to do troubleshooting. Reduce the device complexity. Maybe, but reducing the complexity of the device often means also reducing the capabilities of the device. And so most of the time before reducing the capabilities and complexity, you want to see if you can troubleshoot either training the patient or training those around the patient in that environment. Why? It's because the device isn't broken down, their ability to use it isn't broken down. They have a new thing that's complicated. Especially around communication, this child may have already developed ways to non-verbally communicate with those around them in this example. And so they revert back to those because creating new structures in the brain, new pathways, and learning new things is more difficult if they're already successful in doing what they want. We're going to come back to that example later. All right, in the real world, for example, you might see a client who uses a power wheelchair just fine in clinic, but they struggle at home. Why? Because at home there's tighter spaces, smaller corners, there's less room to navigate. Maybe they have a difficult threshold to get over, and so they just stay on the couch. Same device, different contexts, different outcomes. That's exactly what this type of question is testing. It's going to test if you jump all the way to like whole new device, or if you understand that you need to troubleshoot in different environments first. Let's take it one step further. Maybe the client can use the device, but only under specific conditions. For example, SCI who demonstrates safe wheelchair navigation in therapy and at home, but whenever they get around crowded community environments, they have problems. What's the issue here? It's not the device. It's not the patient being able to use the device. It's not the fitting. What's being tested is a term called generalization. In other words, the patient's ability to use the device across multiple environments, multiple applications. From Cook and Polger's textbook, AT must support functional performance across real-world tasks and environments, not just in isolated settings. So what generalization actually means that the client can adapt to variable circumstances, perform in variable conditions, and maintain the function that they need to outside of heavily structured environments. So again, to hammer in these answer patterns that you'll see. Answer 1, replace the wheelchair with a more advanced model. Nope, you're skipping steps. Provide additional training in the real-world environment. That's a good answer. Reassess the seating system. Maybe that's a good answer too. Maybe their posture is bad in the system. With an answer like that, I would go back and read the question to see if it says anything at all about the patient's posture. If it doesn't, then that's an irrelevant answer. Or reduce the speed of the device. Well, again, that might be the answer at the end if they can't eventually overcome their difficulties. But before we do that, you should provide additional training in real-world environments. It's because the patient has already demonstrated basic control, basic ability to use the device, but they just need more practice and often guided practice to be able to use it. This is going to be a thing where you see the ATP exam and the ATP expectations, the way RESNA has them, are very, very thorough. A lot more thorough than you may be familiar with if you work as an ATP as a vendor. You hear about all this follow-up and you're like, hey, I just got paid to drop off the equipment. I don't have all this funding and time to go back and go to school with them and go to the store with them and go to work with them and have lunch and have them pull up to a table. Remember, the ATP exam is preparing someone who may be a therapist, maybe a doctor, maybe a reseller. There's all kinds of people that may get their ATP credential. And just because you in your life as a technician that worked at a dealer wouldn't do that, doesn't mean that that's not the ideal ATP standards. Because a lot of what the ATP is showing and teaching is about how to be an assistive technology professional in an ideal world. I mean, one of the parts it even centralizes is that funding is not an issue. And we know in the real world that funding is a real issue and a real consideration. All right, moving on. The ATP exam for delivery of equipment is going to distinguish between their performance in an ideal condition versus their functional independence across different environments and unstructured conditions. All right, I think if they have not been able to continue using the device in different environments shortly after delivery, then you're still in the implementation phase. Like in session 7, we got to the client to use the device well in a structured place. On session 8, this type of troubleshooting is about getting the client to be able to rely on the device in multiple environments. It's a very different level. Now let's talk about support system failures. This can be very easily overlooked. Everything looks correct. The client can use the device, but they still don't use it regularly. Why? Let's go back to that device about a child with a communication device. Maybe they use it well in therapy. Maybe they use it well at home, at school, but at home they don't. Why? It's possible that at home they have a mom and a dad which are so familiar with how the child communicates without a communication device that they don't encourage the child to use the device and get better at it. This can be stunting for the child who needs to be able to learn how to communicate both to those who know him or her extremely well, and ideally to strangers, to people in the outside world, to make new connections with people. That broadens their horizons. And so the issue here is not just the device. The issue here would actually be about their integration into their environment, meaning having people that encourage them to use the device, even when their old, maybe dysfunctional methods of getting around or of communicating work well enough. Remember, dysfunction is mostly made up of the word function. And so they may have ways of getting these things done that work well enough, but have problems with it. Another thing could be like, for example, they get a eating device, a feeding device set up. It works well, except for the caregivers that routinely come to take care of this patient don't understand or don't feel comfortable enough to set it up. And so instead of having the patient independently feed themselves, the caregivers just spoon feed them. That's an example of training the support system to encourage the use of the device if that's what the goal is. All right, again, you'll see answer patterns like replace the device, reassess the client needs overall, simplify the interface, maybe, or train the caregivers and support communication use. That's going to be your ideal answer for this specific scenario. All right, let's take a look at early abandonment signals. That's where things can get a little bit more subtle. For example, the device has been implemented and the client used it, but what are the signs that they're going to use it less or not at all? Usually, if you check back and the patient has slowly stopped using it, that's a good sign that they're going to stop using it entirely. At delivery, you can tell if they seem confused or if they don't participate much in actually using the device. That's one of the earlier signs that this intervention may need more training for them to feel comfortable and confident to use it in real life. You didn't choose the wrong device. If you trust your work so far, you just need to train them more. From the ATP exam study guide, early abandonment is often related to usability issues, lack of integration into their environment, insufficient training to get them comfortable using it, or a mismatch between the environment where they can use it and the environment where they need to use it. For example, a client uses a speech recognition software and initially it's successful, but then they stop using it. Why? Maybe because at work where they need to use the device, the environment is too noisy. Maybe they get frustrated trying to do the things they actually want to do using the device, and they don't understand how to make adjustments. So where you'll find your answer is where the change is in between where they were successful and where they're having problems. If you think back to session 6, you might think, boy, I just really failed my development of intervention strategy. The patient's not using the device. I suck at this. No, not quite. Session 6 is about looking forward to all the places where you can catch where there are going to be issues delivering the device in the future. Maybe you plan the training, but in between, maybe the family members that take care of this patient have changed. Maybe the environment they live in has changed. And so even if you did a thorough job in session 6 developing your intervention strategy, session 8, this session right now, is about catching the ones that you missed. There's a continuity. All right, let's go over a couple key insights just to recap, and then a few pitfalls so that we can hammer in what we learned today. From Fundamentals in Assistive Technology textbook, AT must be integrated into daily routines, not just demonstrated theoretical use. Think, is this part of their routine yet? Or just something that they can do, but is not that convenient for them to do? That distinction means a lot. We are making this system hold up and stress testing it versus the things they have to do in real life. We want to provide value to our patients. And so when we provide devices that aren't used very much, we just haven't done a lot to provide value to their life. And that talks to our purpose as a person, as someone that wants to help others. All right, pitfall number 1, assuming that success at delivery means you're done. Nope. If it only worked at therapy, if it only worked in their home in a controlled environment, you're not done yet. Pitfall 2, we ignored environmental variables. You have to remember that a different context means different demands. Pitfall number 3, we missed support system gaps. If those who are necessary to help the patient use the device aren't trained or don't feel comfortable on how to use the device, we have to pay attention and address that. Pitfall number 4, we jump to replacing devices, reassessing our whole plan, thinking that we're terrible at our job and we just need to do everything over again. Don't. You should assume that on the ATP exam, if a question outlines that you have done a correct assessment, the client demonstrated the ability to use, but now they aren't able to, the test is telling you that you did the previous steps correctly. Don't second guess yourself and just assume everything's wrong. Let's start over. And then pitfall number 5, skipping steps or misidentifying the phase. These kind of go together because there are answers like replace the device, like reassess the plan. You're just skipping steps. Like there's lots of troubleshooting that goes on when you're integrating a device, especially a complex device, into someone's life. And so don't jump ahead. Remember that stick in your phase, troubleshoot before you jump to finding a whole new solution. All right, and remember, if the system doesn't hold up across multiple environments with multiple people and in multiple situations, you're not done with implementation yet. That's the whole gist. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and good luck.